his personality, there's a generational thing. You see it in England between people who grew up before the Second World War and people who grew up after the Second World War. And obviously that applies in Germany as well. He was the generation that traditionally there was much more of a separation between generations than there is now. So when I met him, so he's as I say, a generation older than me, and so he would, I would have shown deference to him based on his age, much more so than would be the case now. And he certainly was aware of me, but he wouldn't talk to me in the same way that he would talk to, say, Ted Happold. Even Ted said that he'd only been to Frei Otto's house, I think twice, something like that. One of those times I was with Ted, so I had dinner with Ted and Frei and Frei's wife. But apparently that was a really special thing to have happened, because I think he was quite a reserved man, and not and always a bit separate from other people. I don't think deliberately, and it's possible that he was actually quite shy, I don't know. He certainly came across as being quite confident when he talked. His English was very good. He definitely, if you like, was an architect, not an engineer, in the sense that that's a bit difficult. That's not supposed to be an insult, but he didn't have a sort of particularly logical way of thinking, in the sense he didn't think, well, we know A and we know B and therefore C, and from C follows D. It didn't have that sort of mathematical way of thinking, but he was very inventive, and he had a very intuitive understanding of structures. But that intuitive understanding wouldn't go as far as to enable him to build something that would stand up necessarily. So he had to rely on people like Schleich on the Munich Olympic Stadium, and then later on Ted Happold and Ian Liddell and people for his later projects. So I think he did feel misunderstood. I think he found that on certain projects he found things frustrating. I think Stuttgart 21 was very difficult for many people. The railway station in Stuttgart. So I didn't see him in his later life. So he must have been about. Well, I didn't see him since after about the mid '80s, I suppose. So there was a period from the '70s and into the '80s when I saw him quite a lot, but not so much after that. So I didn't see him in his old age. I suppose he was quite striking physically. You wouldn't mistake him for somebody else. And so he did have a sort of there's a certain, his face and his body sort of fitted in with his structural ideas. He was quite austere looking, but not in a sort of old-fashioned way. And he was certainly charismatic. And from what I hear, some people did find him quite difficult to work with, particularly people who, on the creative side, who felt that he sort of took over that aspect of the design of the building. Whereas if you're I think he found engineers in some ways easier to get on with, because the interface between engineering and architecture is sometimes a difficult interface, but at least you sort of know what you're supposed to bring to a project. I think he did find the British engineers easier to work with than the German engineers. But of course, since then, there's been a sort of renaissance of German engineering, particularly in the area around Stuttgart, with a whole number of large and small firms growing up, following basically the sort of philosophy that Frei started. So there's Jan Nippers, there's Werner Sobeck, there's Schleich, and that in a way it's all to do with the application of sophisticated ideas and technology in architecture.